Welcome to Crown TV. Immerse yourself with a captivating audio from our stories. We provide an alternative way to read books in audio. We upload many audiobooks as possible, from bestsellers to timeless classic. Subscribe and stay tuned for new upload.
Episode 286, Turf Wars. I think we all understand what we're here to talk about today, Chris said, looking at Jessup. But I'll make it clear now. Chris opened the door and said, "If we want to control the underground world of Baltimore, we accept that we will be at war with the Clifton family. We think that the time has finally come to decide this matter." Jessup laughed softly and asked, "Do you think your family has the strength to defeat the Cliftons?" Chris shrugged slightly and said, "Of course. Even if we don't win, we wouldn't miss this opportunity to have a showdown. If you don't think the Stedmans are worthy opponents, that's fine. We'll have a real fight, and then we'll all know where we stand." Chris's determined attitude surprised Jessup, and he felt slightly less confident. "Mr. Stedman, stop spouting nonsense and let's get down to business," Rufus said to Chris. He no longer saw any reason to be polite to him. "So how do you want this fight between our two families to proceed?" Chris ignored Rufus's jibe. He was there to negotiate. "Your father has already thought about it, hasn't he? Let's hear what he's got to say," Jessup said. Jessup knew that Chris's father, Art, wouldn't have sent his son to pick a fight with him without careful consideration. Chris looked at Jessup with respect when he realized that he had predicted his father's actions. Jessup was a man with a lifetime of experience and intuition. He said, "We have 3 possibilities to suggest. I'll give you our ideas and then you can choose." Chris continued, "The first possibility is that the two families physically fight each other until one side surrenders or everyone dies." Jessup had also thought of this option but dismissed it. As the two most powerful families in the underground world of Baltimore, it was likely that neither would concede, so a lot of people would die. The loss could be tremendous. In addition, this story would be so newsworthy that even their families would not be able to keep it under wraps. If news of the underworld fight got out, the reputations of both families and their business empires would be destroyed. No matter which side won the fight, the damage to both families could be disastrous. He therefore felt that it was a very high-risk option with both sides likely to suffer. "What else?" Jessup asked. He had too much experience as a leader to only hear the first suggestion. "The second is to decide through a 1-to-1 fight. Each family chooses one man to represent them, and the 2 men fight to the death in one of the underground fighting rings," Chris said. Jessup was familiar with this option. The victory or defeat of the warrior represented the victory or defeat of his employer. That method was the most commonly used to settle large-scale turf wars in the underground world and to determine gang boundaries. Jessup had predicted that the Stedman family would suggest this option, so he had already asked Alex if he would represent his family. "You have a third way?" he asked. He couldn't think of a third option, so he was curious to hear what the Stedman family might suggest. "Of course we do, and I think it may be the best option for the Clifton family," Chris said. Jessup looked at him curiously as he waited for him to continue. "The third way is..." Chris started, then paused slightly, stared at Jessup and whispered, "The Clifton family admits defeat right now and proclaims our family, the Stedman family, as the bosses of the Baltimore underworld scene." Jessup was so furious that he started coughing violently. Chris had been deliberately provocative. "Dad, are you okay?" Rufus quickly bent down to check on his father. Jessup shook his head. "Chris, you piece of shit! Get out of here!" he yelled at Chris. He was deeply insulted by Chris's display of disrespect. Chris answered, "Calm down. We're just thinking of what's best for your family. If the Clifton family is willing to withdraw from the underground world of Baltimore, the Stedman family will pay you $5 million. Not only will your family receive money, but your reputation will remain unharmed. Surely that's a fair deal." Jessup asked, "Does your family really believe that the Cliftons will lose the fight?" Chris replied smugly, "No, of course, not definitely. But I would say it's certainly probable. There's maybe 90% chance that the Cliftons will lose." He continued, "I must remind you that the Blood Brothers gang in Baltimore is immense and powerful, and that they will support my family. I assume you've heard of them?" Jessup thought. He was right. His family has the support of the Blood Brothers. He said, "Of course the Blood Brothers are a large gang, and they have a lot of skilled fighters. By all means, have them on your side, but don't assume that your family will win." "So you're not going to concede? You still want to fight our family?" Chris confirmed. "Of course," Jessup replied. "Okay, great." Chris stood up and said, "In 3 days' time, we'll meet at the Clifton Underground Boxing Ring. We'll be waiting for you with your fighter. We're looking forward to it. Goodbye until then." Chris turned and left. "Dad, are you okay?" Rufus asked as he looked at his father's anxious face. He was also very worried. "I'm fine," Jessup replied. "Please, fetch Mr. Ambrose." "Of course," Rufus answered. Then he opened the door of the study and said to Alex, "Mr. Ambrose, please come in." Jessup looked at Alex and asked, "Mr. Ambrose, did you hear what was agreed with the Stedman family? Hopefully I don't need to repeat it. I want you to fight for the Clifton family. What do you think?" "First, can you please tell me who the Blood Brothers are? Can we beat them? And what'll happen if we lose?" Alex asked. He knew that Jessup wanted his allegiance, but he had some doubts in his mind. The Blood Brothers is the largest gang in Baltimore. They have a lot of good fighters and several martial arts experts, skilled professional fighters. They are a huge gang, and it will be very difficult to defeat them. Listening to his analysis of the situation brought home to Jessup how bleak their prospects were. The fight will only end by the death of one opponent, or in the unlikely event that one fighter admits defeat, he explained. After a brief thought, Alex said, "Mr. Clifton, I promise I will fight for you." "Are you sure?" "If you don't want to, I understand, and I won't force you," Jessup said. Alex didn't want to fight, but he explained his decision. "I will fight because of Debbie. I know that if anything happened to her family, Debbie would be devastated. I promised her that I will never let her feel sad or afraid again, so I must help her family. Besides, I already feel part of the Clifton family. Listening to Alex's heartfelt words, Jessup was moved. He felt certain that his granddaughter had found herself a good man. Good, he replied slowly. Now that you're officially a member of the Clifton family, I'll call you Alex. Now, go and get something to eat. Then we can meet with the family to discuss how we're going to beat the Stedmans. Alex nodded. Speaking of families reminded him of how he had been forced out of his own family and how much he missed them. It made him feel quite melancholy. Jessup told him, Alex, over the next 2 days, we'll get as much information as we can about the fighters that the opposition are considering. On the day of the fight, we'll all be there to support you, except Debbie. I don't want her to know anything about it. I understand, Alex nodded. He had already decided not to tell Debbie anything about the fight. If she knew that his life was in danger, she would be very worried, and he didn't want to cause her any distress. If he did die in the ring, he could imagine how devastated Debbie would be. He had to make sure that didn't happen. Chris was sitting in his Mercedes-Benz, feeling relaxed. He was pleased with how things had gone with Jessup Clifton. He raced the Mercedes back to his father's villa, pushed open the door and walked inside. Art was sitting on the sofa, smoking. The ashtray in front of him was already overflowing. He wasn't worried about Chris's negotiations with the Clifton family. He just felt that the day when he would take over running the entire Baltimore Underground was getting close. As he imagined the negotiations taking place between his son and Jessup Clifton, he couldn't help feeling excited. Chris walked up to Art and said excitedly, Dad, our negotiations went well. As you predicted, Jessup agreed to a one-on-one fight. Good, Art said. Everything is under my control. No matter which way the Clifton family chooses, we will defeat them. I think they'll send their best fighter, Paul Novak, to fight for them. Is there anyone in the Blood Brothers gang that can beat him? Chris asked. Art replied calmly. Don't worry. Since Tyson Slade has promised to help us take over the Baltimore Underground world, he'll definitely send us his best fighter. Otherwise, we won't help his gang expand on the East Coast. He sat on the sofa, pondered for a moment, then picked up his phone and called Tyson Slade. Tyson answered. Hello, Mr. Stedman. How can I help you? His voice was so deep and masculine that it sounded as hard as a rock. Episode 287, The Fighter. Hello, Tyson. In 3 days' time, the Clifton family are to fight the Stedmans. Please send your best fighter to take part in the battle, Art told him. Art held his breath while he waited for the gang leader to answer. The war with the Stedman family was the most important thing to happen to his family in years, and a lot rested on the man's response. Okay, no problem. I'll arrange for Damon Walker to travel to Baltimore tomorrow. Don't worry about a thing, Tyson replied. That sounds good, Art thought. The gang leader was about to end the call when Art said, Tyson, I believe that the Clifton family will send Paul Novak. He's a famous and much revered martial arts fighter. Are you sure that Damon will beat him? Art knew that this was a fight that his side had to win if he wanted to increase his control of the underworld. He wanted to confirm that Tyson was sending his best man. Are you questioning my judgment? Tyson asked. He thought that Art asking him such a question was a criticism of his leadership. No, of course not. You misunderstood me. I just wanted to confirm that he will win for us, Art said quickly. He was terrified of the gang leader. Damon is the first apprentice of Lee Harshaw, the head of our gang's sect in California. Although I haven't seen him fight for a long time, I am told that Damon is unbeatable by anyone except a handful of men. Do you believe me now? Tyson asked. Of course. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have doubted you. I know you'll send the right man. Art quickly apologized again. Don't blame yourself, I understand your concerns. And I must remind you that after the Blood Brothers have helped your family take control of the Baltimore Underground, you must keep your side of the deal and help us, Tyson said. Tyson had no other friends in Baltimore as powerful as Art, and he knew he needed their help. Their gang wanted to take over a large part of the East Coast. In recent years, the East Coast had developed rapidly and had become a prize being fought over by many of the top American gangs. Yes, of course, Art agreed. And then Tyson ended the call. Besides a lush birch forest, just outside San Diego, there were several large villas. In the garden in one of them, a middle-aged man was slowly pacing, deep in thought. As he walked through the birch forest, yellow leaves crunched on the ground beneath his feet. Finally, he arrived at a blue pool. A man in his 20s was sitting cross-legged at the edge of the pool with his eyes closed. He was deep in meditation. The water in the pool appeared to ripple under his direction, and some pieces split off the stone that was between his legs. He sensed that someone had approached, and his eyes jittered beneath his eyelids. He stopped what he was doing and slowly opened his eyes. He was sitting on the ground. To stand up, he didn't use his hands to support him, but straightened his legs and gracefully stood up. Anyone watching would have struggled to believe what they saw. The young man looked at the middle-aged man in the black robe and walked toward him. His gait seemed leisurely, but he covered the distance very quickly. In moments, he reached the other man. So, your skills have improved even further, the middle-aged man said. He was Lee Harshaw, the leader of the California sect of Blood Brothers, and the young man was his most promising apprentice, Damon Walker. Looking at Lee, Damon said, If you still find it necessary to flatter me, that tells me my skill is not yet equal to yours. I will have to practice harder in order to live up to your expectations. He had lived with the older man since he was a child. To him, he was both a teacher and a father. Very good. Lee patted his shoulder gently. I have a word from the leader. He needs you to do something. Earlier, Lee had received a phone call from the gang leader, Tyson, who told him about the request from the Stedman family in Baltimore. What does he need me to do? Looking up to the sky, Damon felt a little excited. He regarded each mission as a practical test of his skills. Generally, the leader sent other people on straightforward missions. Since he was being sent on this one, he deduced that the opponent must be formidable. The thought made Damon happy, which was a rare emotion for him. You are to go to the city of your birth, Baltimore, to help a family there to seize control of the city's underground world, Lee told him. He had found Damon as an orphan more than 20 years previously, and raised him as a son and apprentice. Baltimore? His heart flipped when he heard the name of his hometown. On the one hand, it was the city of his birth, but he had grown up in California and had no memories of his homeland. The boys he grew up with had always laughed at him because he came from the East Coast and spoke so differently. On the other hand, he hated Baltimore because it was there that he was abandoned by his parents. If it had not been for Lee, who rescued him as a child, he would have died there. He had mixed feelings about going to his birth city to carry out his mission. "Do you have any concerns?" he asked. "No." He shook his head and said, "Please rest assured, I will complete the task assigned by the leader." Good. Damon looked up to the sky and told himself, "So I'm going to Baltimore. Not only do I need to help that family gain control of the underground world, but also promote the prestige of the Blood Brothers gang." He told himself that he would ensure that everyone in the city saw how powerful and prosperous the gang now was. The Blood Brothers had been founded in Los Angeles 100 years previously by a Chinese immigrant and martial arts expert named Hu Julie. At that time, he was a member of a New York gang, the East Coast Dragons, and the city was rife with turf wars between rival gangs in the cities. Rumors were deliberately spread by a rival gang that Hu Julie had betrayed his gang to seek glory. As increasing numbers of gang members heard and believed the rumors, his gang launched a crusade against him and his family, vowing to find him and kill them all. On the night of the crusade, more than 120 members of his family, servants and workers, men and women, old and young, were massacred. Hu Julie was also seriously injured. Just as he was about to be killed, a rival gang charged into his house to attack his enemies. They inadvertently saved his life. By the end, all of his attackers were subdued by the rival gang members, who were determined to kill or capture everyone from the East Coast Dragons. Hu Julie managed to stay out of it, but he knew that people would say that he had betrayed his gang and cooperated with the enemy. Only then did he understand that he and the rest of the East Coast Dragons had been fooled by the rival gang. He realized that the rumors of his treason and collusion with the enemy had been spread by the rival gang. The purpose was to stir up chaos amongst the East Coast Dragons, with the end goal being to completely annihilate them. But by that time, Hu Julie no longer cared who was responsible or what their motives were. His family had been killed, and he vowed that one day he would avenge them. He fled to the other side of the country and lived the rest of his life on the West Coast. He founded the Blood Brothers and always promised himself that one day he would return to the East Coast and settle his blood debts with the East Coast Dragons. Lee handed the information about the Stedman family to Damon. At 8 p.m., Damon took a cab to San Diego International Airport and caught a flight to Baltimore. The next morning at 9 o'clock, his plane landed in Baltimore. The passengers stepped down from the plane. The last passenger to step off the plane was a very tall man with blonde curls and a brown leather jacket. Although he was born on the East Coast, it felt like he had landed in a foreign country. It was much colder, and he noticed that everyone dressed differently from where he was from. Their accents were different, and the buildings looked cramped and gray. He slowly made his way down the gangway. Art and Chris were waiting for him at arrival. Chris stepped forward and said, "Hello, Damon. I'm Chris, and this is Art. The previous night, Tyson had sent Chris and Art a picture of Damon so that he could recognize him. To show his respect, Art personally came to the airport to meet him. "Hello," Damon said coldly. The only person he ever showed respect and humility for was Lee. He had no time for politeness with others. Art wasn't impressed with Damon's attitude, but he continued to smile. Damon had traveled all this way to help them defeat the Clifton family, and he couldn't afford to offend him. They left the airport terminal and climbed into Chris's car. Art told him, "You've been traveling for several hours, so you must be tired. I've reserved a room for you in a very good hotel. You can have a good rest first, and then I'll have someone tell you everything you need to know about your opponent." "Who is the opponent?" Damon asked. "We think it will be Paul Novak, the best martial arts fighter that the Clifton family has. I'll give you his information later," Chris said. "No need," Damon replied with a chuckle. He felt no need to know more about his opponent. He was supremely confident in his fighting ability and knew he could beat almost anyone. He ordered, "Take me to see him, now." "Now?" Art was slightly surprised and explained, "But the fight will not start until the day after tomorrow." "Isn't it better to get everything resolved sooner? Take me to see him now," he demanded again. Damon believed that ignoring the agreement that had been made, taking your opponent by surprise, and finishing things early was the biggest insult possible to the other party. Of course, he wanted not only to insult the Clifton family, but also the other martial arts fighters on the East Coast. Because he had grown up in the Blood Brothers gang, he remembered that one of the most important missions of the gang was to seek revenge on the rival gangs on the East Coast. "How confident are you that you'll beat him if you don't take time to prepare?" Art asked sincerely. He could see that the young man was taking the mission very seriously, but didn't want him to underestimate the opposition. "There will only be one result from my mission," Damon said as he looked at Art. His eyes sparkled with excitement, and it was clear that he was ready for battle. With a trace of a smile, he said, "That's the death of my opponent." Episode 288, The Victor. Art pondered for a moment, and finally decided that he would take Damon to meet Paul. "I'll take you to see him now," he told him. He knew that Damon was a notorious fighter from the Blood Brothers gang. He should easily beat Paul. As a result of his inquiries, Art had found out that Paul lived at the No Surrender martial arts camp, but he hadn't been able to find out whether he had agreed to fight for the Clifton family. "Go to the No Surrender martial arts camp," Art told the driver. They would go there first to look for Paul. The car changed direction and drove toward the training camp, which was on the outskirts of Baltimore. Along the way, Damon looked out of the window at the familiar landscape of Maryland. After being away from the East Coast for so many years, he was finally back. The view outside the window slowly rose from high-rise buildings to mountains, and the wind was so strong that the trees were swaying. Gradually, a building with green tiles and red walls came into view. They had reached the No Surrender martial arts camp. Art, Chris, and Damon climbed out of the car. There were 4 young men dressed entirely in black, standing at the gates of the camp. They were Chris's bodyguards. He had ordered them to meet them there to protect him and his father. The battle between Damon and Paul was going to be fierce, and he didn't want himself or his father to get hurt. Art knocked on the gate, and 2 men opened it. When they saw the 3 men, they were surprised and concerned. They could see that these strangers were not friendly. "Hello, we're looking for Paul Novak. Is he here?" Art asked politely. "Mr. Novak?" When they heard that the men were looking for Paul, they knew they were right to feel anxious, and they hesitated. The last time visitors had come for Paul, several people had been hurt. "Take us to see him, please," Art said patiently. He was determined to stay calm. "Of course," said one of the men. He gave a small bow, and then turned and walked toward the back of the building. The men led Art, Chris, and Damon along a path that wound through the walled gardens and arrived at a small back door. They passed through the door and out toward the mountains to the edge of a cliff. Since he was defeated by Alex, Paul had returned to the martial arts camp to practice and improve his technique. He relived his fight with Alex repeatedly, trying to see where he had gone wrong. He practiced and perfected many new moves. Being defeated by Alex was a terrible blow to his ego, and he had felt very depressed since it happened. He felt that his 30 years of martial arts training had been in vain. After 10 minutes walking along the cliff, they finally saw Paul. He was sitting on a huge rock on the edge of the cliff. "That's Mr. Novak," one of the men said in a trembling voice. Art looked at Paul, then back at the man. Now they had found Paul. They needed the 2 men to leave them alone with him. "Thank you. Now please leave us alone," he said. Damon stepped forward. Holding his fists up and with his head raised, he looked at Paul and called out to him, "Hey, you!" Paul opened his eyes and looked over at them. Slowly he stood up. No one ever dared to speak to him like that. His anger rose sharply. When he recognized that Art was standing behind Damon, Paul calmed down a little. He knew that in Baltimore, the Stedman and Clifton families were enemies. He asked himself, "What do the Stedmans want with me?" "Who are you?" he asked. From the fact that Art was with this man, he knew he was there to fight him. "Have you ever heard of Damon Walker from the Blood Brothers gang?" Damon asked. "I've heard of the Blood Brothers gang," Paul replied. He wasn't surprised. He had been heavily involved in martial arts for more than 10 years and knew a lot about the history of the martial arts movements in both China and America. He continued, 100 years ago, Hu Juli, the founder of the Blood Brothers, betrayed his original gang, causing the deaths of hundreds of fighters. Later, he fled to the West Coast and founded the Blood Brothers gang in Los Angeles. The Blood Brothers are now a powerful gang who use martial arts fighters to act as enforcers and protectors for America's underworld. "Ha!" Damon denounced angrily. He said, "The East Coast Dragons massacred more than 120 of our ancestors. The Blood Brothers have been waiting all this time to avenge their blood debt." He continued, "Today I'm here to take your life on behalf of the Stedman family. Let's begin." "You arrogant son of a bitch," Paul yelled. "Someone like you cannot distinguish between good and evil. I will happily kill you and any other blood brothers I can find." Paul sprang up and contorted his hand into a knife-like shape. He had been depressed since his defeat by Alex. Now he had a chance to recover his self-esteem and prove himself once again. He wanted to use Damon's blood to pay homage to the dead of the East Coast martial arts fighters before him. The move that Paul used was skillful, but well known. When they saw Paul's attack arc through the air and his body move as fast as lightning, Art and Chris quickly stepped back so that they didn't get hurt. In the blink of an eye, Paul was standing in front of Damon, but his opponent stood stock still. He looked at Paul dispassionately, as if he didn't care about him at all. Paul held his blade closer to Damon's neck. Art held his breath, thinking that at any moment he would hit the young man's neck and kill him. When Paul's hand was only a few inches from his skin, Damon finally made his move. He pulled in his legs and suddenly he was a few feet away. It seemed impossible that he could have escaped, but he had. Paul's blow had cut through nothing but air. Paul gasped in shock. How could this man have avoided his attack? Suddenly he felt afraid of Damon. He had a terrible feeling that he could not beat this opponent. Damon looked at Paul with a cold smile and said, "I heard that you're a master of martial arts, but is that all you've got?" "I've got more than enough skill to kill you," Paul yelled as he rushed at Damon again. His body twirled and his feet kicked out at his opponent. To the spectators, it seemed that Damon reacted very slowly. But in reality, his movements were lightning fast. He was quicker and more agile than Paul, and in less than a second, he'd blocked his opponent's attack and hit him in the chest. Paul tried to attack him, but only managed to graze his arm. Damon's movements were so agile, and his body was so light that he appeared to move like the wind. By the time Paul drew near him, he had already dodged out of the way. As each man paused to catch their breath, Paul looked up at the sky and thought desperately, "How can this young man be so powerful?" Damon shook his head and sighed. "It seems that all true martial arts experts on the East Coast are dead. I find it pitiful that a fighter like you can be called an expert," he said. He was happy to discover that his enemies were so weak. His comment infuriated Paul. "Shut your mouth," he yelled. He knew that he was being shown up in front of everyone. Paul took a deep breath and then straightened his body and launched himself in the air like a torpedo. "It's my turn to show you what I can do," he cried. He thought, "Now let's see what you're really made of." At the same moment, Damon also rushed at his opponent. As before, his movements seemed slow, but his speed was actually extremely fast. When there were only a few yards separating him from Paul, he moved even faster. The whirlwind of his kicking legs gave the impression that he had 10 legs instead of just 2. Before Paul could reach him, he kicked him hard in the chest, and Paul fell to the ground. He vomited a mouthful of red liquid onto the ground, and felt that all his internal organs had been kicked to pieces. If he moved his body a little, his stomach cramped in agony. Paul looked up at Damon and said in wonder, "Shinshinbu?" He was referring to the martial arts technique used by Damon. He had never seen it used before, but he had heard of it. he had never expected to experience it used on him. Shinshibu was an ancient martial arts style from 19th century China. At the time that Hu Juli had founded the Blood Brothers, it had gradually declined in popularity over the years. In recent years, it had almost disappeared altogether. After Hu Juli had arrived in California and founded the Blood Brothers gang, he wrote down everything he knew about martial arts into books for later generations to learn from. He also hoped that one day he could return to the East Coast to avenge the blood feud of the rival gangs against his family. "Ah, so you're not as ignorant as you look," Damon said. He slowly walked over to Paul with a ruthless expression on his face. Every member of the sect had been drilled on the purpose and mission of the Blood Brothers gang. The tens and thousands of members all knew about the blood feud between the gang and the rivals on the East Coast. Damon had grown up in the Blood Brothers and had a deep understanding of their history. And now, in front of him, was a man who had been disrespectful to the Blood Brothers. He walked up to Paul and kicked him in the head. Paul was almost unconscious as he lay on the ground like a dead dog. Damon showed no mercy as he kicked him again. Paul soared into the air, and his body landed right on the edge of the cliff. The sudden landing jolted him back to awareness, and still dazed, he grabbed the edge of the cliff with his hands as his body was suspended over the edge. "Help me! I'm going to fall!" he managed to cry. "Huh!" Damon sneered. In his opinion, Paul was a joke. When dealing with his enemies, Damon never showed mercy. He stepped on Paul's hands with his feet and ground down heavily. "Ah!" Paul cried out, as he was forced to release his trampled hands, and he fell over the cliff. There was a scream, and after a few seconds, there was a loud thud. Episode 289, Countdown to Battle. When they saw how easily Damon killed Paul, Art and Chris were stunned. They had never heard of anyone with so much skill and power. Damon slowly turned around and walked over to them. Art, Chris, and the two men who had led them to Paul were terrified of him. They took a step back and one of the men tripped over. Damon walked up to Art and said, "I want you to tell everyone that you saw me kill Paul. I want the news spread right through the world of martial arts and get back to all the East Coast gangs." He wanted all the martial arts gangs whose ancestors had participated in the massacre of Hu Juli's people to be afraid of him. When the Blood Brothers gang returned to the East Coast for good, that day would be the day they finally settled their blood feud. "Yes, of course I will," Art said. Although he was a powerful man, he had just witnessed a display of strength beyond his wildest imagination from Damon. He looked at the fighter with fear and respect. Damon saw everyone looking at him with absolute awe. He smiled to himself and hummed. To him, these people and their opinions meant nothing. To him, wealth and social status were meaningless compared to the power that his martial arts abilities gave him. Now, he just wanted to go back to the camp to clear his head. To him, the fight had been a little boring. Paul had not caused him any difficulties at all. For him, the only pleasure was that, as a result of the fight, people in the East Coast martial arts gangs would hear of his prowess and fear him. Art and Chris walked with Damon out of the camp gate. climbed into the Mercedes-Benz, and returned to the city center. Along the way, Art's tension and fear gradually abated, and he became relaxed and even cheerful. That morning he had been consumed with worry that if they couldn't find a fighter who could compete with Paul Novak, they could easily lose the war with the Cliftons. But already Damon had killed Paul, the most powerful warrior on the side of the Clifton family. That meant that the Stedman family would certainly win the fight in 2 days. He felt as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He paid for the most luxurious room for Damon at the Capitol Hotel and sent 6 bodyguards with him to ensure his safety. As Art drove away from the hotel, he sang quietly to himself. His fingers gently tapped to the beat. He didn't realize that he was in such a good mood until Chris said, "Dad, I haven't seen you so happy for a long time." Chris smiled and continued. "Now that Paul is dead, it'll be obvious to the Cliftons that we will win the fight. I wonder if they'll try to bargain with us now." Art shook his head slowly and said, "No, based on what I know about Jessup Clifton, he would rather die in the fight than surrender to us. He's both stubborn and proud." "Now that Paul's dead, who will the Cliftons send to fight with us?" Chris asked curiously. "Whoever they send will lose. It makes difference to us who it is," Art said dismissively. Then he added, "Chris, when you get back to Baltimore, you must spread the news that Damon defeated Paul Novak just as he requested." Just as soon as he requested. As soon as that news is released, everyone in Baltimore will know that the Stedmans are the victors in this war, Art continued. That night, Chris spent many hours on the internet, telephone and social media spreading the news of Paul's death at the hands of Damon. He informed everyone that mattered in Baltimore, all of whom were interested to know the outcome of the war between the two families. Everyone who heard the news was surprised. The Cliftons had been the most powerful family in the city for many years, and their best warrior had been killed a few days before the battle by Stedman's fighter. Those who had previously been unsure about which side to support suddenly felt that the decision had been made for them. If Paul Novak, the most powerful fighter for the Clifton family, was dead, the victor was guaranteed to the Stedmans. The top business families and entrepreneurs in Baltimore were concerned about who would be running the city's underground world in the future. But for the East Coast martial arts gangs, the focus was different. Paul Novak, one of their most infamous fighters, had been killed by the West Coast Blood Brothers gang, which had a blood feud with the East Coast gangs. This news was explosive. Over the last 100 years, the Blood Brothers had almost completely disappeared from the East Coast. The news that their fighter had killed Paul Novak had put them back on the radar. People in the East Coast martial arts gangs started speculating on how strong the Blood Brothers had become. In addition to being employed by the Stedman family, did the gang have any other plans to expand their strength on the East Coast? They were all worried and continued to quietly watch what was happening. Many of them wondered at what point would they have to get involved. In the Clifton family mansion, Jessup whispered the name Damon under his breath and looked at the information in his hand. The old man's eyes contained deep sorrow. An hour previously, the Clifton family had received the news that Paul had been killed. Jessup had been shocked to the core. According to people who ran the No Surrender martial arts camp, Paul had been unable to fight back and had not posed any threat to Damon. If Paul had been beaten so easily by Damon, would Alex stand any chance at all? Jessup's family had all become very flustered when they heard the news. They were like frightened animals in the living room, pestering him with their questions and doubts. "What can we do?" asked one. "Our trump card has been taken out before the battle even started. Are we really going to lose to that bullshit Stedman family?" said another angrily. "We knew that they would contact the Blood Brothers sect, but we didn't do anything about it. Why didn't we prepare sooner?" said another. "Get out of here," Jessup finally exclaimed. He looked at his family and thought, "My sons are useless. They're not helping. They're only annoying me with their presence." His sons were quiet when they saw how angry their father was with them, and they all left the room quickly. Only Rufus remained in the living room with Jessup. "When you speak with Alex, tell him what Damon has done and remind him to be careful," Jessup told him. "Yes," he replied. He felt saddened when he looked at his father's worried face. For the first time, he realized that his family might lose. Rufus dialed Alex's phone. At that moment, Alex was standing outside the residential building at the university. He was hungry and wanted to get something to eat in the canteen. Two beautiful girls approached him holding containers of carry-out food. It was Callisto and Luna. "Mr. Alex, we bought Chinese takeout for you. No need to go to the canteen. There are too many people queuing in there. We'll take it in turns to bring you food," Callisto said. They had been watching Alex standing guard every day and wanted to do something to help him. "You're so kind to me," he said as he smiled at them. The canteen had a special dining area for employees, so he wouldn't have had to queue. But he didn't tell the girls that. They had been so kind to think about him. The smell of the food was making his mouth water. At that moment, his phone rang. Alex saw that it was Rufus calling and answered the call. "Alex, we found out who is fighting for the Stedman family. His name is Damon, and he's an apprentice of Lee Harshaw, the leader of the Blood Brothers sect in California. Just over an hour ago, he killed Paul without breaking sweat. Later, I'll give you all the information I have on him," Rufus said. "Okay." Alex was shocked when he heard that Paul had been killed. He realized that his opponent was even stronger than he thought, and he was worried. "I'll pick you up at Johns Hopkins the day after tomorrow. Try not to worry too much. We have faith in you. Just try your best," Rufus said. But Alex could hear the concern in his voice, and he guessed that although Rufus wouldn't admit it, he predicted that Alex was going to lose the fight. "I will," Alex replied. After a few more reassuring words, Rufus ended the call. Callisto and Luna could sense that something was bothering him, and Luna asked anxiously, "Mr. Alex, is something wrong?" "The day after tomorrow, I will fight for the Clifton family. Please take good care of Debbie for me that day. She mustn't know what's happening," Alex said. "Mr. Alex, who dares to challenge you in a fight? We should go and kill him first," Callisto said angrily. "I've promised the Clifton family that I'll fight for them, and I'm afraid that you can't go in my place." but I promise you that the person who can beat me has not yet been born. I'll end the fight as quickly as possible, and then I'll return," Alex said with fake confidence. He didn't want the girls to worry about him. When he said this, the girls laughed. "That's right. Of course that man won't beat you. If he dares to fight with Mr. Alex, he's a fool," said Callisto. Luna agreed. "My guess is that Mr. Alex can make that man kneel down and beg for mercy within 3 moves. They both felt absolute confidence that Alex would win. "Well, as you two said, I have no doubt that I will win," Alex assured them. Then he added, "But you can't let Debbie know about this. Do you understand?" When the 2 girls nodded, Alex felt relieved. He said, "Come on, follow me to the restroom. I'll eat my meal and you two can have a rest." The following 2 days passed quickly, and the day of the flight arrived. Everyone involved in business or the underworld in Baltimore had been obsessed with the battle between the 2 families and squabbling amongst themselves about who would win. When they learned that Paul, the most powerful warrior of the Clifton family, had already been killed by the Stedman family's fighter, they felt that the matter had already been resolved. In their hearts, they did not doubt that the Stedman family had won. On the day of the fight, people started arriving at the Underground Boxing Club, the venue of the fight. They all felt that they already knew who would win, so there was no sense of excitement in the crowd. They were only there to show their loyalty and to flatter the Stedman family, the future overlords of Baltimore. Episode 290, Preparing for the Fight. Jessup dressed in an elegant 3-piece suit and slowly walked out of his room. His family had been the domineering power of Baltimore for decades, and he wanted to look the part. His family members were waiting for him outside the door, but they were not as calm as he was. They still didn't know which warrior was going to fight for their family. By the end of the day, the Clifton family would probably have lost the leadership of the Baltimore underground world, and their name would disappear from the history of the city. From that moment on, their family would only decline. Jessup Clifton walked steadily out of the mansion, with his children and grandchildren following behind him, as if it were a grand ceremony before a war. Several luxury cars were parked at the gate of their mansion. "You go to the venue first," he said to the family behind him. Then he looked at Rufus and said, "Rufus, let's go collect Mr. Ambrose." "Sure," Rufus said. He followed Jessup to one of the cars. They climbed in and drove to John Hopkins. "Mr. Ambrose? Mr. Ambrose?" the rest of the family asked each other. They looked at each other in bewilderment. Then they agreed that Mr. Ambrose must be a warrior that Jessup had temporarily recruited. However, it had taken them years to find a fighter as good as Paul Novak. If he had been killed so easily by Damon, what chance did a last-minute replacement have? Reluctantly, the Clifton family climbed into the cars and drove to the underground boxing ring. It was a Sunday, and Debbie was finally taking a break from her studies and relaxing. She stepped out of the residential building with the 4 girls of the Moon Cult. The 5 of them had become good friends. Of course, the Moon Girls had not forgotten their identity, or that they were there to serve Alex. But this meant that they also served his wife. They accompanied Debbie to class every day, bought food for her, and gave her massages when she was stiff from studying all day. They were taking good care of her. Alex was still standing guard outside the residential building when Debbie and the girls walked out of the door. When he saw the 5 women walking out together, he felt very happy. "After work tonight, let's go to the lake together," Debbie said to Alex. She had been attending classes and studying so much recently that she was aware that they hadn't spent much time together. She didn't want him to feel neglected. "Tonight?" Alex said, and then paused. He didn't know what to say. That night he would be representing the Clifton family in the fight, and he was desperate to make sure that Debbie didn't find out about it. But looking at her beautiful, eager eyes, he couldn't bear to turn her down. He nodded and said, "Okay, I'll call when I finish work." "Well, we'll leave you to work. We're going to the library," Debbie said happily. Then she turned and walked toward the library with Callisto and Luna. Celeste and Celine stayed with Alex. When Debbie had gone, Alex went back to his dormitory and changed his clothes. It was time for him to go to the school gate to wait for the Clifton family to pick him up to go to the boxing ring. Celeste and Celine followed Alex. They were determined to go with him. When he reached the gate, he saw a luxury car waiting for him. Jessup and Rufus climbed out of the car and briefly exchanged greetings with him. Then, all 3 of them climbed back into the car and drove to the underground boxing ring. The Clifton Underground Boxing Ring was the most famous in the underground world of Baltimore. It was located centrally in the city, and directly above ground was the Baltimore Exhibition Hall. It was a very secret location and well hidden. At that moment, the exhibition hall looked calm, but below ground, it was already very busy. 200 yards in front of the exhibition hall, Jessup and Rufus, Alex, Celeste, and Luna stepped down from the car. They planned to walk there to the boxing ring. Alex felt a shiver up his spine. He turned around and saw a shady figure in a hoodie standing watching him nearby. The figure saw that Alex had seen them and immediately hid behind a tree. Celeste and Celine had also spotted the figure, and they rushed toward it. "Come out!" Celeste shouted, as the 2 girls rushed behind the tree and attacked the figure. The person was surprised. They hadn't expected 2 girls under 20 to have such advanced martial arts skills. The person quickly retaliated, but Celeste and Celine were too fast and ducked out of the way. Alex stepped over to defend the girls. "Mr. Alex!" Celine cried and stepped in front of Alex. The figure stepped into the light. She had black hair and eyes as black as sapphire. Her face was full of defiance and courage. It was Chelsea Wood, the police officer who had led the team the night Alex had dealt with Julian and Chris. "Why are you following me?" Alex asked when he realized who she was. "Is something going to happen here?" Chelsea asked. That day, when Chelsea had walked past the exhibition hall after work, she saw Chris and his father heading underground. Then, she witnessed many well-known entrepreneurs, influential families, and suspected gang members follow them in one after another. Only certain people had been informed about the fight. Other than the important people who had been invited, it was completely hush-hush. As Chelsea observed who was arriving, she became convinced that something important was happening that evening. She wanted to go underground to have a look, but there were several men at the door who wouldn't allow her in without an invitation. So she hid at the door to see what would happen. She was surprised when she saw Jessup and Rufus arrive, and even more so when she saw that Alex was with them. "Leave quickly. You shouldn't be here," Alex told her. "What's going on here? Something illegal? I'll call backup to stop whatever's about to happen," Chelsea said. She knew that the Clifton family was involved with the criminal underground, and when she saw them arrive, it confirmed her suspicions that something illegal was about to take place. "Leave before I shut you up forever," Jessup hissed angrily at her. "Dad, please calm down," Rufus said. He looked at Chelsea's face and asked, "Are you Chelsea Wood?" "Yes, and I'll make sure that all of you villains end up in jail." After Chelsea had transferred to Baltimore, she learned from colleagues that the Clifton family ran the city's underground world. In her eyes, the family members were all criminals, and she vowed that one day she would wipe out the entire family. "Little girl, you know you're no match for us. Leave now if you don't want to get hurt," Clifton said. Rufus sneered and told her, "Okay, I'll tell you. There's going to be a fight here tonight, and the winner will become the king of the underground world in Baltimore. All the important businessmen and politicians know about the fight, and it will go ahead because we have the tacit consent from the city leaders. It's well accepted that our family is required, in addition to the police, to maintain peace and stability in Baltimore, and to prevent constant feuds between rival gangs. Do you understand?" The tacit consent from the city leaders? Chelsea was shocked and didn't know how to respond. She suddenly felt like a fool, but still struggled to believe what Rufus had said. Jessup looked at her and said, "Girl, why don't you just go in with us?" When he saw that she was hesitant, Jessup ignored her and walked slowly toward the exhibition hall. After a moment, she followed them. After a thorough inspection on the first floor, Jessup led the others down toward the boxing ring. There were already a lot of people waiting at the entrance. Art and Chris had arrived half an hour ago, and a lot of people were gathered around them, talking with them excitedly. The other members of the Clifton family were very reserved. When Jessup arrived, a few people greeted him out of politeness. "Mr. Clifton, hello," one man said. "Mr. Clifton, you're here," said another. They all showed great restraint, because they all felt that the situation was very clear. The Stedman family would easily win the fight. Their allegiances were now with them, and they couldn't be seen being too friendly with the Cliftons. When the rest of the Clifton family saw that Jessup had arrived, they all started to complain. "Dad, everyone is being so rude to us. They're all sucking up to the Stedmans now," said one of his sons. Another agreed. "Yes, people are acting like they don't even know us. Some are blanking us completely, like they haven't seen us. It's all to flatter the Stedman family. It's disgusting." "Dad, did you collect Mr. Ambrose?" someone asked. "Yes, where's Mr. Ambrose?" asked someone else. Jessup didn't answer them immediately. He felt disgusted by their whining. "Hello." Alex took the initiative to step forward and say hello. "What? You're Mr. Ambrose?" asked one of Jessup's sons. Everyone was open-mouthed in surprise. They had all assumed that Mr. Ambrose, whom Jessup had recruited to fight for their family, would be an expert in martial arts. They never expected that it would be such a young and gentle-looking man as Alex. They were all thinking that Paul Novak was beaten so easily by the Stedman family's fighter Damon. Although this young man looks fit, he's not a well-known martial arts fighter. How can he stand up to Damon? When they saw him, their last hopes were dashed. Collectively, they groaned in despair. Art noticed that Jessup had arrived and walked over to Chris. They were surrounded by a large group of people. Chris's cousin's family also arrived with Julian, who was being pushed in a wheelchair. Lee Dempsey, a rich and influential businessman Debbie and Alex had encountered in the past, was amongst them. He happened to be in Baltimore on business, and with his family's influential status, he had naturally received an invitation. He was looking forward to watching the fight. "Hello, Mr. Clifton. We meet again." Art politely greeted Jessup. He was determined to appear magnanimous in front of the crowds. After all, he would soon be the boss of the Baltimore underground world, and he needed everyone's respect. "Hello," Jessup said reluctantly as he shook hands with Art. When the Stedman family had first arrived in Baltimore, Art was just the head of a small company. At that time, he had brought a gift to the Clifton family to show his family's respect and allegiance. Jessup could never have foreseen that in only 30 years, Art would be seizing his position. But the underworld was never predictable. "Which warrior have you brought today?" Art asked. He was curious to know what the Cliftons would do now that their prize fighter, Paul, was out of the picture. "Mr. Ambrose, please come and meet Mr. Stedman," Jessup said. "Of course," Alex answered. He walked over to Art, nodded slightly and said, "Hello, Mr. Stedman." When they saw Alex, no one could believe that he was their fighter. Had the Clifton family recruited a 20-year-old boy to fight for them? It seemed like a joke. "It's you." Chris recognized Alex, and his expression became cold and cruel. Julian saw Alex from his wheelchair and said, "Uncle, it's this bastard's fault that I'm in this wheelchair." Art raised his hand slightly, and Chris and Julian stopped talking. "Jessup, is this the best fighter you have? To send such a boy to fight, aren't you just giving victory to my family?" Art said to Jessup arrogantly. He had been courteous when they first met, but he also felt that it was important to demonstrate his dominance. He had already planned that once he was the underground boss of Baltimore, he would show kindness and authority to his subordinates.
Thank you for listening to Crown TV. Please don't forget to subscribe, share and turn on the notification button.